Hello and welcome to another Organization Behavior Capsule Lecture. Today we're going to talk about power and politics. Power is somewhat out of favor with organization behaviorists. In fact, it's not even covered in some textbooks anymore, which I find pretty strange actually. But I think it's because it's got some fairly negative connotations, that somehow in the 21st century we shouldn't be using power, we should use all these other modern management tools. Well, yeah, but if we didn't have power, using those modern management tools is going to be so much spinning of wheels. Power is basically the latent ability to influence others' behavior, thoughts, or actions. Pretty simple stuff. So as a concept of organization behavior, it tends to be associated with some other things. That power suggests an ability to overcome resistance, and it owes much of its existence to feelings of dependence that, except for interdependency, people largely don't have any power whatsoever. So from our perspective, power is going to start with structural issues. So although individual skill determines the effectiveness of the use of power, power is not fundamentally an issue of person or personality. It tends to be inherent in a position or role within the organization. So, structure establishes how we allocate roles, expectations. Anytime we're talking about the allocation of scarce resources, which is one of the older definitions of management, we're inherently talking about an exercise of politics and power. Those persons and those units that have the responsibility for performing more critical functions in the organization have a natural advantage. Pretty simple kinds of stuff. That if your task is important to the completion of the organization's task, you're inherently going to have more power. So it needs to be understood in that structural context. That the exercise of power depends in part on intergroup dynamics. So we're going to have competing coalitions of individuals. This is where the politics comes in. That these coalitions compete with each other continuously over scarce resources. And by resources, we don't always mean budgets. A university I used to work at, you could tell people's position in the hierarchy, first of all, by looking at a professor's office, whether or not they had a window. That was a pretty blatant example of powerlessness when you can't even see the sky or the grass from your office. And it's intimately linked with leadership. Leadership is, in some parts, the exercise of power. Historically, that was seen as being part and parcel of it. That leaders were indeed people who could exercise power. They were essentially synonymous. Think of Machiavelli's The Prince. He was talking about the use of political power to accomplish the goals of the state. From this perspective, leader, supervisor, manager mean the same thing. I don't buy that, because we've talked before about leadership and how different I see it, as from being managers. But people who possess power by virtue of authority of the position they occupy pretty much are the exercisers of that power. That's the authority-based power. Max Weber, in his classic Wirtschaft and Gesellschaft, talked about the basis of power in organizations, although he was talking about authority structures. And he saw three of these. The first of these was tradition. Elizabeth Regis is queen because her father was king. Pretty simple relationship. That's tradition. Then there's a power based upon the idea of charisma. Napoleon was able to take 300,000 men and attack Moscow in the dead of winter because of his exercise of that charismatic power. But what Weber was principally interested in was what he called the rational legal variant of bureaucracy, which is that power was given to individuals on the basis of rational selection. But we also need to remember that Weber's model for his sociology was the army of Friedrich the Great. But the idea of authority-based power comes from that to a certain extent. Control over scarce resources and having easy access to people who have perceived power, largely further up in the hierarchy, a central place in a potent coalition. That is, you are at a nexus where stuff gets done. The ability to work the organizational rules. We admire those people and despise them simultaneously who know how to get things done in organizations. We need them. But they make us uncomfortable. And then, of course, credibility. Particularly in knowledge-based organizations, the people who have power are those that know stuff. Pretty simple relationship. Some of the authors that talked about this, French and Raven, start from the premise that power and influence involve relations between at least two agents, and therefore they theorize that the reactions of the recipient is the more useful focus for explaining power. That is, why do people follow others? They saw that there were 5 bases of organizational power, of social power, and these you should keep in mind. Reward power, we've talked about that being very potent. The perception of coercive power, that is, do people think that you can make them do the job? Well, if you're the boss and you can fire them, yeah, you have coercive power. Legitimate power, that's that box that you occupy on the org chart. Referent power, do other people model your behavior? Do they look up to you? Do they see you as someone that is worthy of emulation? And then finally, the 5th source of power is expert power. You guys are listening to me because I know stuff that you need to know. Therefore, I have more power in this relationship. Very, very basic kind of relations. And you'll find that a lot of our models, use French and Raven's basic criteria as a starting point. David Mechanic, though, talked about feelings of dependence, and lower organizational members have an array of tools with which to make other people dependent on them. Well, think of the appointment secretary to the President of the United States. This person wields enormous power because they decide who gets in and who doesn't get in to see the boss. But yet, on an org chart, this is just a lowly, receptionist. Yet they wield enormous power. So expertise, effort and interest, attractiveness or charisma, location and position, location by being located closely to people with power, membership in coalition, and the knowledge of the rules. Very similar. Jerry Slancik and Jeff Pfeffer moved on from that. They see power as one of the few mechanisms available for aligning an organization with the realities of the environment. Jeff Pfeffer is our finest author on power. His book on it is an absolute masterpiece. So whatever you think of Jeff, this is good stuff that you probably need to read someday. And in that, Slancik and Pfeffer say that power accrues to individuals and subunits that handle an organization's most critical problems. These people get things done that are key to the organization, therefore they're going to wield enormous power. Pfeffer and Slancik, however, do believe that power is shared in organizations out of necessity, more out of concern for principles than rather participatory democracy. We don't do this because we're altruists. We do it because it's easier to get the job done if we share that power rather than holding it closely. They say there are 3 contextual conditions, if you will, under which power is more easily exercised, where we might have more power in a subunit. The degree of resource scarcity, the criticalness of the resources to the core activities, and the level of existing uncertainty about what an organization should or shouldn't do. That is, in a more uncertain environment, those who seem to be getting things done will tend to have more power. Pfeffer claims we often attempt to avoid the social realities of power and influence. And I think he's correct here. And it causes us to lose our chance to understand these social processes and train managers to cope with them. The exercise of power makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And Pfeffer's making a good point there. Organizations, he says, need leaders who are not afraid to influence and exercise power. He concludes with a reminder that managing effectively requires recognition of competing interests as they relate to points of concern and the understanding that power is needed to get things done at all. And I think that's probably a salutary point for us, if you will, that power is the ability to get things done. And after all, That's the entire purpose behind there being an organization at all, isn't it? To accomplish a task, to achieve a goal. And without power, you can do none of that. Well, I'm Dwight. Have yourself a good day, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.